What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another review. And this time we're taking a look at A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, starring Tom Hanks and directed by Marielle Heller. Now, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood tells the story about how this jaded and cynical journalist named Lloyd Vogel goes to interview the one and only Mr. Rogers, and during the course of his meeting with Mr. Rogers, he befriends him, and his entire worldview changes. So that's pretty much the basic premise of this movie, which is based off a real life friendship between this journalist named Tom Joad and Fred Rogers himself, in which Tom Joad kind of had his worldview change when he met Mr. Rogers, and made him see the world in a different light, and not so much cynicism and skepticism. Okay, so, but how does this movie work as itself? I thought this movie was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. This is the definition of a uplifting, heartwarming movie without being overly sappy with it. Uh, Mr. Rogers, he's one of those guys who is always genuine. Like, you never heard a bad thing about Fred Rogers because he was legitimately one of those human beings that cared and valued humanity to its utmost. I mean, you can put this man in front of a serial killer, and he will find a way to not, and he will find a way to give sympathy to that type of person. That's just the kind of man that Fred Rogers was. He was someone who always saw the goodness in people. And I thought that Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers captured that essence and that personality perfectly. When I saw this movie, I didn't see Tom Hanks playing Mr. Rogers. I saw Mr. Rogers. Tom Hanks disappeared into the role. He brought that loving and caring personality to Fred Rogers to life on screen with his portrayal. And even though Tom Hanks has a supporting role, and he's not really, he's Mr. Rogers is the focus of the movie, but Tom Hanks is not in the movie all the time. The movie focuses on the character of Lloyd Vogel and his story, which revolves around Mr. Rogers. But whenever Hanks is on screen for the time that he's on, he steals every scene that he's in. He captures the essence of Mr. Rogers perfectly. I really, really enjoyed the chemistry between Tom Hanks and Matthew Rhys, who plays Lloyd Vogel, this cynical journalist who has his own story. This character of Lloyd, he's married, he has a son, he also has a very strained relationship with his father, and his encounter with Fred Rogers changes his worldview, and and throughout the course of the movie, we see Lloyd struggling with his feelings, and at the end of the movie, and of course, he starts to open up more and starts to be more forgiving, because the whole strained relationship with his father revolves around his father pretty much cheating on his mother and not being there when Lloyd's mother passed away. And of course, Lloyd has a lot of resentment for his father, who was played really, really well by Chris Cooper, by the way. I thought Chris Cooper as the dad did a really good job with the role, and I really like Matthew Rhys as Lloyd Vogel. I thought Rhys and Hanks have a really good on-screen chemistry with one another. I buy their scenes together, and they just work really natural off one another. I like the actress who played the wife as well. I thought she was fine in her role as well. So yeah, like again, from an acting standpoint, I thought everyone was on par. I thought everyone was really brought their A game immensely. From a production standpoint, I like the visual aesthetic of this movie. I thought Marielle Heller did a wonderful job directing this picture, and I like how she made this movie feel like an episode of Mister Rogers. Like they have these. There's a lot of shots where they use miniatures, like you saw in the Mister Rogers show, as transition shots, and they look pretty cool. I really, really like them a lot. Like, they did a real good job at making this movie feel like an episode of Mister Rogers. And the beginning of the movie, it pretty much nails that perfectly, where we see Mister Rogers do his whole shtick and he talks about Lloyd. And like I said, the whole movie plays like an episode of Mister Rogers' Neighborhood, which is just fantastic, and it's really, really clever. And it deals with the themes of forgiveness. And I thought it handled it in a very mature and not so sappy way. Now this movie overall is very, very uplifting and very, 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 and very friendly. But it does have a couple of dark moments here and there. You know, like when Lloyd is dealing with his father, they get into a really brutal fist fight, and then near the end, Lloyd is kind of like goes through like this daydreaming sequence where he's encountering Mr. Rogers and his wife as characters from the Mr. Rogers show, And it's pretty much, this is all Lloyd's internal struggle of him not being able to cope with his feelings and him not being able to express himself because of his cynicism and just the resentment that he holds. But because he encountered Mr. Rogers and Mr. Rogers pretty much implemented his philosophy onto Lloyd, Lloyd ends up growing into a better person. He ends up being more forgiving. At the end of the movie sees him forgiving his father and making amends with his father before his father passes away. The entire movie is also building up this friendship between Lloyd and Fred Rogers, which becomes very, very genuine. So the movie to me did an excellent job of capturing everything in a nice, very mature way. You had rock solid performances, really good direction, beautiful cinematography. This was a good looking movie. I like the musical score. I like this movie was great. I don't have a lot of bad things to say. I thought it captured the essence of Mr. Rogers with maturity and with respect, and it really did a great man justice. So with all that being said, I'm going to give A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, I'm going to give it a perfect 10. I thought this movie was great. The more I let it marinate and the more I think about it, this is a damn good movie. I highly recommend it if you're a fan of Tom Hanks. I definitely recommend it if you are someone who grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. You will not be disappointed with this movie. It's really good. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comment sections down below. Like the video and subscribe, and I will check you back next time for more.